You are listening to Decoding Impact, a podcast by Sattva Knowledge Institute, hosted by Rathish Balakrishnan.
Welcome to Season 2 of Decoding Impact. Every fortnight, we will engage leading thinkers and practitioners to understand what it takes to solve systemic problems at scale. For all the curious change makers committed to understanding the trade offs and incentives to make this world a better place, this one's for you. Millets have the potential to address the three big crises of our time in India, namely the climate crisis, the economic crisis, and the nutritional crisis. India has been leading the discourse to develop the dialogue of millets globally, so much so that 2023 has been designated as the International Year of Millets by the UN. Despite these tailwinds, the millet market is yet to develop a sustainable rigor to gain a significant level of popularity among Indian consumers like quinoa or oats has. This revival hence needs a systemic approach across demand and supply to enable greater scale. Today's podcast is going to be a rich exploration on how millets as a crop of the future can help unlock a model of production that is good for us, good for the farmer, good for the businesses, and good for the environment. To help us navigate this discussion, we have Mr. Sivakumar, who is currently the Group Head of Agri and IT Businesses at ITC Limited and is a member of its Corporate Management Committee. He also oversees ITC's Sustainability and Social Investments Program. Mr. Sivakumar has also been engaged as an advisor for the agriculture industry at a both national and international level. Thank you for joining us, sir. It's a pleasure to have you as part of our podcast today.
Thanks, Rathish. Looking forward to this conversation.
Sir, I think as we had mentioned in the introduction, millet seems to be the crop whose time has come. The 2023 being the year of millets, the amount of conversation on millets in India and also as part of the G20 agenda currently, where we are talking about it to other countries, seems to be on the rise. And while this work has been on for a while, I think the moment really seems to be now. And before going into what is happening, sir, I think it will be great to hear from you. Why millets? And what are some of the unique advantages and benefits that millets is bringing to the conversation on the issues that is important to India today?
Yeah, many dimensions. In fact, millets, at least when you hear in theory, looks like they are really a magical millets from a consumer health and well-being perspective, from how it can deal with the natural resource conservation and climate resilience, as also potentially raising farmer incomes in particularly rain-fed areas. So you could look at each of them separately. Let me start with the consumer side. While when you say millets, of course, there's several millets are there. There are some major millets, whether it's sorghum, bajra, ragi, or there are many other minor millets like kakum, kodo, sawa, kutki, and so on. Each of them obviously have different nutritional profiles. But in general, they are a great source of micronutrients and they are important for the overall health and well-being. Millets are also a good source of protein, rich in fiber. Each of the micronutrients, whether you look at iron, which is an important source for really formation of the red blood cells and therefore carrying oxygen to the body, or magnesium, which helps in maintaining bone health and the blood glucose levels and improve nerve function. Calcium, which contributes to stronger bones and teeth. Zinc, which is, in fact, everybody realized during the COVID period, the importance of zinc to the immune system function and the healing. Potassium, for that matter, which also aids in regulating blood pressure and improve heart function. Phosphorus, very much like calcium, stronger bones and teeth. So a host of benefits. One millet may have a little more of one of these micronutrient and a little less of the other, but all of these are present mostly in many of the millets. Then there is, of course, vitamins, B complex in particular, which supports metabolism, energy production, nervous system function. And also millets overall are low in glycemic index, therefore it helps manage blood sugar levels. Even the natural antioxidant levels are higher in millets, which help eliminate harmful free radicals from the body, which means we are protected against various chronic diseases. So I think a list like this goes on in terms of not just health for sick, but health for healthy. It retains well-being. I think a host of these things looks almost incredible, but that's what millets can do from a consumer perspective. So doesn't it sound really incredible as to all of these are just in millets and we don't get to eat as much nowadays?
Absolutely, sir. I know you're coming in with the other aspects, but I was just, as you were counting it out, I'm guessing people are going to just stop the podcast now and say, this is all I'm going to have all my life, because it seems to check all the boxes of what we need for a healthy life.
Yeah, absolutely. So while that is on the consumer side, and obviously those who start become converts. I'm well aware I'm one of them. Started about 4 years ago, but I'm a convert. And so many of the people that I know. The other one is to do with, natural resource and like water, topsoil, and so on, and then climate change. Natural resource, world at large, India also in particular, the way we are consuming water, like it's available forever, we don't need to bother about it, the way the soil is getting damaged for many reasons. All of this, in fact, as you know, the world counts Earth Overshoot Day as to how long we take to renew the natural resources that we are consuming in a year. And when we started measuring, it was a balanced number. Like by December 31st in a year, we will renew whatever we consume in that year. Yeah, that means we have a balanced. But as years progress, notwithstanding measuring this, we've not been able to manage it. And slowly it slipped into November, October, September, August. And now as we reach 2023, by July, pretty much we exhaust the natural resources that we can renew by December 31st. So that means for 5 months, we are literally borrowing, not borrowing, actually, one could say stealing from our children and their children, the natural resource that rightfully belong to them. So one needs to deal with natural resource without any doubt. The other is the climate change. Generally, one knows about climate change, but there are some numbers that the Center for Science and Environment had put out on the eve of COP27 a few months ago for India-specific numbers. That for one, India had witnessed extreme climate event in one or the other place in 90% of the days. It's as many as 90% at one or the other part of the country. Then 3 out of 4 districts are extreme event hotspots, whether it's delayed monsoons or erratic rainfall in terms of unevenness or untimeliness or hailstorms or cloudbursts, heat waves, and so on. And as many as 40% of the districts have exhibited what is called a swapping trend, which means that traditionally flood-prone areas witness intense droughts and vice versa. So generally one knows climate change and we see that rains are happening in the summer, or hailstorms are occurring and heat waves are there. But when you look at these kind of numbers, you see how big the change has been. And now it looks like we cannot do a lot to reverse this. At least we should adapt in certain areas and perhaps take steps to mitigate further deterioration. And millets can play a role in both adaptation as well as mitigation. And that's the reason one could say this is again a magical from that perspective as well, because unlike paddy and wheat, whether it is sandy or loamy or clay soils, one can grow millets under different rainfall conditions. One can grow at less than 500 mm or more than 1500 mm. Also can be grown in different temperature ranges, less than 10 degrees and greater than 40 degrees centigrade, and at different altitudes as well. So I think it's versatile and very adaptable. And some millets like little millet can withstand even waterlogging, which is a challenge at times. And especially when exposed to some kind of stress, whether it's biotic or abiotic, good recovery also happens. From the resilience and adaptation point of view, I think some of these is really like magic. And lastly, if one were to replace, let's say, rice with millets, it would actually mean reduction in irrigation water demand by as much as 33%. And millets are also environment friendly because they are what are called the C4 plants. That means they avoid photorespiration and therefore absorbs higher carbon dioxide. I think all of these are a host of reasons why millets came into attention after the Indian government had brought it as the Year of Millets and now the International Year of Millets at the instance of government. And certainly for right reasons, we should be looking at a topic like this.
Thank you, sir. And I think I want to build on what you said, because I think you framed it very, very clearly as the triple crisis I think the world is facing. One is, of course, the climate crisis. And I often say that we are not exporting rice and wheat, we are actually exporting groundwater, today. And I think water table is one thing, but the host of other climate change, repercussions of agriculture is significant. And agriculture consumes 90% of the water table in India today. So I think it is a significant aspect of our long-term resilience as a country. So the climate is one part of it. The second is the food and nutrition aspect of it. And especially for a country like India, in given global rankings that we've had, and also globally, nutrition is becoming a larger question, not just for the rich, but for everybody, and so on. The third part of it is, especially, and that's something I would like you to touch upon also, sir, is the income of people in India. 47 to 51% of Indians today rely on agriculture, And one of the benefits of millets, given the profile of the farmers that are involved in farming of millets, is also that if you are able to unlock value from millets, their own income goes up as a staple product, especially in environments where water table is not as rich as it used to be in Punjab and Haryana. So I'd love to also have you share about what does it mean for the farmer from an income point of view and from other benefits point of view as well, sir.
Yeah, certainly where millets are grown at this point of time, which are relatively more rain-fed regions and by the smaller farmers and marginal farmers, mostly in whether it's, like I said, rain-fed, so arid and semi-arid kind of regions. And because they are drought tolerant, that's where it is grown. And they're also low resource consuming, and therefore smaller and marginal farmers can afford to grow them. Not too many inputs get used. It's reasonably widespread, although a few states grow a lot more, like Rajasthan, Karnataka, Maharashtra, UP grow them a lot more. Then, of course, there are other states as well, whether it's Haryana, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, a little bit in Uttarakhand. I think it's states take a larger share, but the first four that I talked about are a lot more. And obviously, being a drought-tolerant kind of a crop, low resource-consuming crop, there is a preference for farmers to grow millets. But by and large, it has remained, barring in some pockets, a subsistence kind of a farming. It's not commercial crop for multiple reasons. One, of course, we talked about a lot of health benefits and so on one side, and aligning specific millets with specific consumer attributes. I think some of that offtake has not taken off, although farmers do grow it and much of it goes into non-food consumption and therefore relatively lower value. And from the farmer side, while it is resource conserving, as I had mentioned, and climate resilient, but where it is done is more by default. It is not that consciously where resources will potentially get consumed 10 years from now and therefore I should start conserving now. It's not that kind of a deliberate choice in larger parts. So while the growing side has some activity happening, but there are questions on economic, significant upliftment of margins. And then, of course, given the focus that happened on many other crops for productivity improvement, the level of increase in the productivity hasn't been substantial. In fact, the overall acreage, like you mentioned, come down compared to the time of Green Revolution days. So I think it's happening, potential exists from the farm income side, but there are issues that one needs to navigate through before that potential is realized.
The point you made right now, which is also contrasting with what you said earlier, which is if it's such a magical crop and if it has so many benefits, the land coverage shouldn't be coming down, it should be going up. And so it'll be good to sort of deep dive into what are some of those systemic challenges that I think is holding back the promise of millets. And as you rightly said, anyone who's consumed it has become a convert, but we need way more converts both on the farmer side and on the consumer side for this to happen. And one of my personal realizations always is when you talk about millets, you assume it is one thing. Millets are millets and we should solve it. But, there are more than 150 varieties of millets. And even in your introduction, you talked about, the most common ones, the rare ones, and there are so many regional varieties. How does that complicate the challenge of millets overall as well? Maybe it'll be good to start with that premise and then go from there.
So let's look at a very broad level. We talked about consumer well-being, health and all that, and therefore demand side aspects. At one level, there is a center of plate opportunity for millets as a more nutritious staple. Another level, there is a snacking opportunity as a more healthy snack. And both are very large markets. But if you look at anywhere between 17 to 20 million tons of millets, depending on what are you counting in and keeping out, actual value-added consumption of the kind that I talked about as why millets are preferred by consumers, it's a very small fraction of this. Because at a broad awareness level on nutrition and health exists. If you ask anybody, are millets good? People say very likely yes. But the key barriers are, for starters, isn't taste. One has got used to rice and wheat for a few generations now, and consequently we say that no, these are more tasty and refined. These as in the rice and wheat as opposed to millets. Even the look and feel, I hear complaints from consumers who started new in terms of the color or the texture of the food that goes in. And even cooking time and effort. A lot of people say, okay, you can't just consume millets as is. You need to soak them for a few hours. And so that again is a challenge, how consistently they get cooked and so on. So the time and effort is also an issue. On top of all of this, there's a lot of complaint on the price also. People say, yeah, we would like to consume flour made of some of these, but it seems to be much more expensive than the wheat atta or rice for different kind of dishes. Obviously one has to work on popularizing recipes, possibly initially through some kind of proportionate mixes which will balance the taste and all that. Snacks, of course, do benefit from masking the taste or enhanced with some spices or sweetness and so on. But the larger volume comes out of center of plate, and therefore one needs to deal with that also. Just adjoining that, when you look at the challenge, which actually a part of processing, but pretty much one can also see them as, from a demand perspective, as relevant, is the shelf life. How long can the flour of millet stay fresh is an issue. When will it start developing a little bit of bitterness or rancidity because of its high lipid profile which exists. And then, of course, moisture is the hidden enemy in many of these millets, and therefore the right kind of dehulling and drying for optimizing moisture is something which hasn't been well managed so far. That's another barrier. Machine efficiency for dehulling is very low. Hardly you recover 70 or 80% of grain, and therefore the remaining comes as unhulled or broken, and that impacts economics. So therefore, whole separation itself of husk is not so easy. One dehuller is not suitable for all millets. The size is different, the shape is different, the husk content differs. So I think all of those kinds of issues is the other kind of a barrier which is there. And now if we turn to growing, at the end of the day, if you have to consume more, 70 to 20 million tons, there's plenty of millet, but it's the right kind of millet that we want, right consumer attribute, like I mentioned. And MSP, the minimum support price increase in the recent times has helped. If one counts from 2014-15, it is almost doubled as opposed to some 50% increase for other grains. So therefore, the price support has come. And if you say as it is, it's a lower offtake for the value added. I talked about price being one of the issues from a consumer perspective. Further headroom for price is rather low in terms of how much further you can take it up to make it meaningful for the farmer. And while talking about production, I said as it is, the cost of production is low because it's a low input consuming, low resource consuming crop. And therefore, further cost reduction is also not possible so much to improve the profitability. And therefore, the only available routes from a farmer's perspective, one is, of course, the yield improvement. You look for better varieties that are aligned with the consumer traits that we spoke about, more extension work for planting practices, or pest management and harvest practice and so on. The second is the quality as per end use. How do you get the right cultivars for different kind of end user, map them to the consumption? And which also means, given the level of complexity in dehulling multiple types of millets in one kind of a mill, what makes possibly sense is moving things like post-harvest activities of drying and dehulling closer to the farm, because one type of millets are grown and therefore you can customize machines there. And it's a near farm value addition, possibly by groups of farmers, whether farmer producer companies or otherwise, will also mean plowing back a little more money into the hands of the farmer. And nearer farm value addition is ideally done there as opposed to moving it downstream and making it much more complicated. So there are obviously challenges, as magical as it is in terms of potential. The challenges are also literally 360 degrees in terms of consumption side, in terms of prices, in terms of processing side or farming side. So it's a classic case of how do you look at the whole system to solve it and not pick up one piece at a time and try and solve it.
I'm reminded, sir, of how typically, when ideas come out of research, they have high potential and then they have to meet the market's window of viability. And this is true for every sector. And I feel like what you said about millets is like that, right? Consumer is willing to pay so much and a farmer has to make X amount of money and that has to meet. And if there is a way to make the promise of millets work within that economic boundary, then there is value. I want to actually, you made a lot of very important points. I want to double click on a few of them a little bit more. One point you made was around the preference of the customer from a taste, cooking style, all of that point of view. Are there some varieties of millets that are more, easier to fit into that taste mold and, cooking style molds today than other millets, sir? And do you, over a period of time, see that it will become an 80-20 where, let's say, 20% of the varieties actually account for 80% of all the consumption that we will have today? And is that the most scalable way of even promoting millets for us in this country?
Yeah, I think obviously there are a few major millets, like I said, which have some reasonable popularity and on the 20-80 basis, they can get scaled. There is the top three in terms of jowar, bajra and ragi, which are sizable in terms of already crops which are there. Half of all the production is bajra. In fact, some amount of research also has happened on that front in terms of some yield improvement and so on, because that's been the topmost crop. And the next largest is jowar, which is half of bajra, and then ragi, which is half of jowar. So there is very clearly a 80-20 working there. But I think what is useful to look at is, how do you create that demand from multiple perspectives? As I was thinking, some kind of a three-pronged positioning, just that 20-80 angle or something. So we talked about different millets having different properties, more underscored. And therefore, consumers said, this is why I want to consume this millet or a mix of millets. Then you're positioning it like a smart food for consumers who can afford to pay. That's one segment very clearly. And then you have potentially a lot of scale coming from several government programs. As you know, government is a sizable food buyer and distributor. And within government programs, one through the Anganwadis and so on, the mother and child millet consumption for mother and child, because that's how you can deal with stunting, which is malnourishment, which is a major issue, which is there. And related thing is also in terms of midday meal to create demand at scale. So for certain highly nutritious kind of cereals, how do you get there? And a part of the 2080 will also work here. And some of that will go into the first part that I talked about. And lastly, since we were talking about those farmers growing and sustenance and all of that, the another important segment is really in terms of farmers who are growing millets themselves. If you, for whatever reason, make it attractive enough to it as a cash crop, and then say that farmers actually sell it off and instead buy other staples, then obviously you are taking away the potential nourishment which could have been retained, much needed in these rain-fed areas for the farmers. And therefore, how do you build the awareness so that a portion of it is consumed by the farmers for their own self-consumption? So while there are multiple millets, multiple benefits, one needs to again look at it in a segmented fashion as to where do you get value from, where do you get volume from, and how do you ensure part of it is also retained by the producers themselves, as different ways of tackling this.
And I think two thoughts that emerge from what you're saying. One, as you rightly said, there are probably multiple markets for this, which is the value-added, product. There is a staple product. There is a local consumption product, and more, and especially global exports as well. And I think we were at some point the leaders in exports. Now we're second. So how do we break this down and then map the right millet to the right use case? I think that will probably be very critical. And also, as you were speaking, sir, I realized that it is important because if you want to look at economic thriving of a larger group of farmers, the more varieties we enable, the greater the regional economic thriving as well. Because if it's only going to be some varieties, then we have a certain homogenization that will happen, and a lot of the rich diversity we have within millets will get lost. So finding a way to do that, I think, is going to be an important aspect. And I think your market segmentation idea to say, don't think of it as one homogeneous market, but break it down to the staple market, value-added market, others, etc., the global markets, local consumption, I think is going to be a very, very important part. The second thing that I was thinking of as you were speaking earlier about taste is we sort of underestimate how taste is acquired over a period of time. Like, we were not a rice eating and a wheat eating community from the start. I mean, we were probably more millet eating than rice. And I remember when I was a kid about getting the milk ads and the egg ads, etc., which sort of changed our food plate in some sense. And do you see that as being an important part of this, which is to not assume that people will not like it, so they will never like it, but cultivate the taste for millets in a focused approach and manner? But I'd love to hear your thoughts there, because you've seen a range of decades of growth in some things like this.
Yeah, like I was briefly mentioning earlier in another context, I think issue is how do you popularize certain recipes? How do you start with certain level of mix? It's not that you switch 100%. There is 10%, 15%, 20%. So you need to get that right balance. So therefore, innovation has to happen on that front in terms of how do you bring that to do it over a period of time. Just by bombarding a communication, there's a great consume, it will not happen. You need to also do this recipe. And therefore, a fair amount of work does happen, both the effort by the government at a general level and marketeers at a brand level in terms of how do you create these recipes and product development, and then slowly it works. Because you just say consume this particular millet and you leave it at that, it is very unlikely that consumer will develop a taste for it in a few days. Do it this way, like one is used to creating, let's say, a poha millet, something which is very similar. How do you add different kind of spices? Which spice goes well with it? And there's an area of work that people do and then popularize. So the developing taste needs to happen with all this surround sound, and then it works.
Absolutely. And I think the point about recipes is an important one because like it sort of starts from the consumer behavior and then work backwards rather than just communication, which sort of leaves at the higher level as well. The third point you mentioned, sir, that I wanted to come back to are aspects like moisture, shelf value, and how much does it stay. Are there any technological breakthroughs that you think are critical today that are necessary, sir? I mean, even from a technological breakthrough from processing, from seeds, etc. Do you feel are critical in this, or is it just an adoption problem that what needs to be done is available but it's not just getting adopted? Love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, it's more of some amount of R&D work that is certainly required in this area. Work on what is the best way to optimally do dehulling and drying in a manner that it enhances the shelf life and improves the yield. There are a couple of areas where R&D fund should flow in. Certainly, this will be one of them. What we already know on how to deal with it is more like 10% I would put, and 90% is yet to be researched and discovered. I have seen in a few competitions in recent times, some of the startups working in this space, some amount of effort also happening from some of the national institutions, and some of the companies which are working on the brands obviously also are looking at what do we do on the processing front. But there's an area where the research funds should certainly flow through. And of course, the other area is also in terms of how do you create attribute-specific cultivars so that we pronounce certain areas. If someone requires more bone health and calcium needs to come in, so how do you work on a particular kind of a cultivar? And so things of that kind would also make it a lot more appropriate from both a consumer perspective and farmer economics perspective when you do that. So that's another area of research as opposed to plain yield improvement work, which of course continues.
I want to come to the last part of what I picked up from what you said, sir, which is really establishing infrastructure closer to the farm so that the benefits accrue to the farmer and we are also able to work for different varieties. I'm not an expert, but one of the things I've always recognized is the disaggregated nature of farmers in India often makes it challenging for creating infrastructure that is decentralized. The farmer producer organizations are a good model, but even there, in my learning has also been that miniaturized versions that farmer producer organizations can find viable and manage with their level of quality of throughput becomes an issue. As you think about this decentralized infrastructure, which I think for India is absolutely necessary, and for millets, given their regional variations, are necessary, who's going to be critical to play a role here, sir? Is it industry setting this up in a way that is decentralized? Is it sort of FPOs becoming larger, more organized, and hence having the structure? Or is this something that a state has to invest in to sort of enable as a public infrastructure that enables it? But what do you think will be viable for us to be able to make this work as an approach?
Ideally, FPOs investing in some near farm infrastructure would work better because we have seen many other areas where investments are done by the government, but capacity utilization hasn't been good. A number of areas across the agriculture sector in terms of fruit preservation and also in terms of some amount of grain processing and all of this. So I think it is important that you create an ownership on part of the farmers to align with how on-farm work is done, post-harvest activities are done in a manner that feeds into the processing activity at an FPO level. And obviously at an individual farmer level, it's not viable. And as you take it further downstream, like I said, identity segregation is going to be an issue. Multiple type of millets need to get done in the same machinery and so on. So it's also not as viable as a solution. Therefore, of course, there can be government support as it happens for FPOs to get this. There is Agri Infrastructure Fund. But when the right machines are invented for the right sizing at the FPO level and brought in, that would be a good model to create for immediate post-harvest processing and thereby make it production ready for the next level in the value chain for further value addition, which is also good means both for operations as well as for realization of a better price from a farmer's angle.
So this is very, very helpful. I wanted to sort of summarize what we spoke about. We talked about 4 different challenges, on the whole. The first challenge we talked about, maybe I'll start at the end, which is really how do we build the decentralized infrastructure? We said, now working with FPOs to establish the decentralized structure, I think is going to be important because it allows for specificity of infrastructure to the crop and the type of millets that we are raising. I think that's one part of it. Second, we talked about the need for R&D that is required for solving for some of the more shelf life problems, processing problems, etc., which are critical. And as you said, we are probably 10% progress that we've made over the 90% that we need to achieve. And I think that is important. Third, changing consumer behavior on taste by starting with consumer behaviors first. So starting with recipes rather than just broad-based communications, I think is going to be important. And then looking at part of the plate, where are you coming in, 15%, 10%, etc. The fourth part of it is to segment the markets for millets differently and then map the varieties to the markets and grow the market separately, etc. I think is going to be important as well. Apart from these, sir, I just wanted to check, are there other more important investments or priorities that we should focus on for us to grow to millets before I come back with the next question that I had?
One of the other things, earlier also you, let's say, reposed a puzzle in terms of the price, possibly unwilling to pay a higher price, and farmer needs a higher price to make it viable. And how do you make both of these meet? Because there is so much magic in millets. I think that's an area that I can build on and see how do you make this more remunerative for the farmer and without necessarily paying from the pocket of a consumer. That's another magic we need to create to make it work. In some sense, the way these problems are tackled, it's like tomorrow's opportunity being largely pursued with yesterday's solution framework. We had different measures to popularize many aspects of agriculture, whether you gave free water to keep the cost lower for the farmer, free power, subsidized fertilizer, and so on, to obviously to support farmer who is resource poor, who needs more production to be self-sufficient. This is the way to make it happen. But many of these actually will work counterproductive in case of millets. These are water-saving crops, which is good for the world. These don't use as much fertilizer, which is good for the world from emissions perspective. And we continue to follow yesterday's solution framework, then obviously these are not going to get popularized. So how do you create additional income for the farmers from possibly the carbon and natural resource offset markets is where the part of the solution lies, rather than from the consumer. There are increasingly with net zero commitments that are happening, voluntary markets are emerging. So how do you create value out of natural resource being consumed here, soil being improved here, in terms of emissions being reduced here, and all of that, and create a value and get it to the farmers, whether as individual farmers or through the FPOs, is one way to ensure that you improve the farming viability without pinching the consumer pocket, other than for, of course, a small segment which for right attributes will be willing to pay a higher price. For otherwise large majority, this would be a route to take.
I think it's a very important point that you mentioned. And I think the framing that you had, which is really how do we build the right models for today's environment and not for the yesterday's world, I think is important. And I feel the time is right also for an accounting model that looks at who is accruing the benefits here. Because it's not just a customer accruing benefits for millets, it's also the markets, it's the environment. And if we don't create the right incentives for those benefits to accrue, then they don't get measured. Because then it gets measured based on what a consumer is willing to pay. But the value of millets is actually accruing for the environment and the society. And as you rightly said, the carbon market type of structure is a way for accounting for those benefits that I think is important. And I think it's a very, very important point. And I'm glad you brought it up. I wanted to make 2 points. One is related to this, which is to the old model, to the new environment and the context we are in. Are there some learnings from the Green Revolution, sir, that you think we should make sure we don't repeat? I mean, there are so many positives from the Green Revolution, but it took a certain approach towards mass cultivation, production. As we now have a new staple crop that we are sort of bringing to market and looking to change farmer behaviors, and you have the experience of having seen the Green Revolution play out, are there some learnings you would say we should keep in mind? Saying, those are things we should not do again, and maybe those are things we should sort of keep in mind and do here.
Yes, man, absolutely. If you have to move from Green Revolution to, I don't know what word is coined for millet revolution, perhaps a brown revolution, since that word has not been taken up. So from Green Revolution to Brown Revolution, there are a few things that one must continue to use because they have been good, and a few things possibly we need to unlearn. At a macro level, the government played the lead role and ensured that a full 360-degree solution was put in place in terms of getting high-yielding varieties of seeds and ensuring that the extension work reached farmer and ensure that farmers' rest of the enabling elements of irrigation is available, and then put in place a procurement system and then eventually brought it out to public distribution. So the lead role played by the government made sense because it is food self-sufficiency objective with which all of this is put together. So obviously no element was left out that one needs to wait and see whether it will work or not, but all of that was put in place. So in terms of thinking through that, you need to put the whole solution in place is very much relevant as an aspect that one must continue, because we saw also here all elements which are important, whether it's demand creation through benefit awareness, product development, processing development, production, crop R&D, policy framework, including potential voluntary markets for carbon that we just last talked about, and even possibly water and all of this. The basic difference is that it needs to be brought down to a little more micro level, because food self-sufficiency was at a macro level, demand existed, that we were short of food and therefore you produce and it reached the farmer and the consumer at both ends. But now we need to make it a little more demand responsive, because we saw that just producing more millets is not helping, because we have 20 million ton millets but not enough value added. Because the demand responsiveness of the value chain and rest of the production system need to be orchestrated by the market. There are multiple segments, like I talked about. There are some segments which need to be anchored by the products and markets. There are some segments which could continue to be dealt with and led by government. And so therefore it is in terms of how do you create that micro level ecosystem, which would mean potentially a fair amount of collaboration also, because these different elements are often dealt with by different organizations, someone in crop R&D and someone else in branding, and along the whole value chain, there are different sets of people. So therefore, how do you get collaboration going in a demand responsive mode will be slightly newer kind of angle. Of course, a few organizations like ITC are better endowed due to diverse business inside the group. As you're aware, we have launched as ITC Mission Millets as part of the International Year of Millets, where we brought together the different capabilities of hotels business and foods business and agribusiness all reside inside ITC. It's the collaboration that I was talking about from an external perspective is eminently possible inside, and therefore that much more seamless and effective. And hotels works on recipe development, consumer immersion and all of that. The foods business works on process development for shelf-stable manufacturing and The agribusiness works with the farmers through the FPOs and ITC Marts digital ecosystem for improving that. So as a part of this, a range of products put in the market at one end to all the way working at the farmers. So I think the shift from green to brown revolution has to be obviously continuing with some good lessons and some unlearning to suit the new context.
And I mean, I think two thoughts. I mean, you made a lot of good points, but two thoughts that stood out for me were very, very critical, sir. One, I think at the time of Green Revolution, we probably assumed an infinite availability of natural resources in some form, like our use of water, use of soil. We said, this is going to sort of keep replenishing itself. The boundaries don't exist. I think we are more aware of the boundaries right now. So designing for it, enabling the right incentives for it, and accounting for it in some form, I think is going to be very, very important, because otherwise we will sort of get to another irresponsible dead end, which I think we cannot come back from this time. So I think that's another important one. And the second is, like you rightly said, how do we establish an orchestration of the demand where it's industry-led demand approach and not just one industry? And I think that's a very important point, but multiple industries, so that this sustains itself. Because I think looking back, one of the learnings from the green revolutions is one state offers incentives that are not time-bound. Revoking them becomes very hard. And it often then becomes a question of how do you sustain those incentives against the practical reality of where markets have reached. I think it becomes a challenge. And I think establishing the right market approaches here that take into account the benefits of the farmers, I think is also going to be an important part of the process. I had two follow-up questions so that I'll ask them together, and I think then we can move on to the last part of the discussion. One, sir, is one of the other learnings of Green Revolution has also been that the producers of products, rice and so on, or anything, moved away from their own consumption to purely a market-based approach, which resulted in adverse impact for their own, family and nutrition levels that is showing up in many surveys and results that we have. And so what was an economic incentive became a health crisis in some form. And is there a way we can learn from that and ensure that the producers are consumers of products, especially given the magic of millets that we've been talking about? I think that was one question I had, sir, and I would love to get your thoughts. And the second related question is, when you talked about industry leading this entire effort, and you've been a pioneer at ITC to be able to do this. But as an insider, it'll be great to get your thoughts on what is the industry sentiment around millets today as well. Are they being cautiously optimistic? Are there certain barriers from an industry lens that we should be aware of? Because as you said, if industry has to lead it, knowing their constraints and knowing their sentiment, I think is also going to be important. So those were two questions I had to what you had mentioned earlier.
So in terms of producers retaining for consumption for its nutritious value, there are both kinds of examples in Green Revolution. I think one can learn from both. Like I said earlier, of course, the solution is in raising awareness of the benefits of consumption, and certainly some retention it will lead to. And if part of the value comes out of things like offset natural resource markets and carbon markets, then it is also naturally will lead to some amount of retention rather than completely market price-based kind of situation. We have interesting examples in case of retention. Because government buys fair average quality of produce, in certain states, farmers just work on maximizing the yield, but for domestic consumption will actually buy better quality wheat. There are examples of that kind also, in terms of saying that this is all right for probably making some maida and some biscuits and all of that. So therefore, it's okay, fair average quality into the procurement system. But for my home consumption, for making right rotis and chapatis and all of that, I need a better quality with more broken starch content or more hectoliter, whatever parameters there. And therefore, we'll say that I'm selling off what I have at MSP, but I will buy, even if it's slightly more expensive, for consumption. So there's that extreme also. And at the other end, not only not retaining enough, and in fact, interesting example from case studies on milk. In fact, as milk become more and more commercialized, the retention became very limited, and in fact, therefore, children very little milk because it was a powerful incentive to sell it off and therefore had a nutrition challenge. So one needs to balance both. Of course, we talked about supplementing through other programs like Mother and Child program and the midday meal and all of that, where one cannot retain or where one is not growing. But it's an important area. It's not just producing for somebody else and ignoring my own health and well-being as a producer. Make me aware, create accounting systems and incentives in such a manner that I don't lose out in giving away what I'm producing is something that we cannot ignore in this round of action. In terms of what industry is seeing, certainly there is a lot of buoyancy, no doubt. One sees that, yes, hard work is involved. It will take time. It will not be an overnight scaling that will happen. One can bring in a fair amount of innovation. Like I said, in our own case, that I can talk about a range of products, millets, starting with 100% to as low as 15-20%. You got in different kind of flours. You have cookies and noodles and different kind of snacks and all of that. So it's a range of products which are there. Not only pure millet flour, which is available in the market, but an interesting recent addition was to create a multi-millet mix so that the consumer can mix it and nutrify the regular food at home. Yeah, and this comes with multiple millets from a lot of nutrition. It has sorghum, ragi, bajra, nawane, quinoa, many of these. So there are different kinds of innovation taking place, and yet we know that it's a long haul. But given that a fair amount of awareness is being built through the International Year of Millets, so there is a tailwind which is there that one must make use of. Multiple companies coming and talking about multiple products is also good in terms of the decibel levels from a consumer perspective. And government also, I think, a very useful incentive structure was the PLI scheme, where injection of millets into many of these products, whether for domestic or for export markets, is also supported. So it's a buoyancy and optimism, but we know it will take time.
As a last part, sir, I just want to sort of bring a lot of what we talked about together in terms of tangible actions. As I was reading your profile, one of the things that struck me is that you probably have the most 360-degree view of the agriculture ecosystem. You're from IRMA, you've been in NABARD, you've informed state policy, you've been in the global forums around policy, and of course, you're an industry veteran. One, I wanted to ask you, from your vantage point, are there some things that are already working well? Establishing the right infrastructure or the right type of programming that you think is worth emulating? And also any action in the social impact space that you feel is right in the right direction. I think that will be great to hear in terms of what is already working well that I think we should do more of.
Of course, millets, since the time it was seen as a national year of millets, there have been a fair amount of action on part of many states, most notably the Odisha in terms of the millets mission. And of course, there's still a long way to go, but it's a notable kind of a case. But what I can pick up, both from a social impact and the overall approach, is the model of Operation Flood, the Amul model and how it was nationally scaled. Two things I could pull out. One, a necessary condition, and one, a sufficient condition, if one were to put it that way. Among the first things I heard on the Amul model was no Anand without Mumbai. In fact, in our very first induction program at IRMA, Dr. Kurian was talking about this, which is market first. We talked about the conversation today. Markets and milksheds were linked in a national milk grid in the whole design of the project itself when Operation Flood was getting created. If you didn't have market in Mumbai, the Anand cooperative wouldn't have succeeded. And that was the whole idea. You can't just be production centric and keep producing more and hope that it'll get consumed, however low the price is. First of all, if it's low price, obviously it's not attractive enough, but it needs to be a demand responsive production system. And in this case, how do you create that for high value millet variants is the takeaway. So therefore, the necessary lesson from there is market first. While I talked about systems approach, one need to deal with everything. The pump priming has to happen from the market, the demand side of it. And the second element is that systems perspective, which is the integrated intervention. It is just creating demand is not good enough. One needs integrated intervention, not one at a time. That I raise production now, I create demand next, I create processing solution next. Because before they get scaled, like in the startup world, there is an idea and it's tested, and before it gets scaled, there's a valley of death. You'll have to leap over that valley of death to succeed and scale. And if one doesn't do this as an integrated intervention, single interventions are likely to be lost, and then therefore one is forever searching for that potential magic some stage. So therefore, the same example of Operation Flood and the Amul model scaling in terms of productivity through feed conversion efficiency was brought in, veterinary care to raise the competitiveness, or technology innovation to process buffalo milk, first for the world actually at that point of time, to deal with perishability and balancing lean and flush seasons and marketing. And so I think integrated intervention is the sufficient condition for that systems approach is something that I would underscore as another takeaway from that. So market first and integrated intervention as a systems approach. I think these two are things that one should bring in here, both for potential economic value, environmental value, and social value. And millets do possess that kind of opportunity.
Absolutely. Last question from my side, sir. It's just what you've talked about. I think it sets the framing very well. I have one question I always ask people in the podcast is, what is the role of philanthropy in all of this? Because I genuinely believe there are things that philanthropy should not do because it will skew the market or it will create perverse incentives. But there are cases where philanthropy can add the right catalytic value. Here, maybe I'll broaden the question a little bit. From your experience of seeing all of this, what are some areas that you think philanthropy can contribute? But I also would like to ask you, where's the role of the state as an investor most relevant in this entire piece? I think that would be another question that I would have.
So I think two areas of philanthropy could potentially in farmer capacity building, because that's obviously the weakest part of the value chain in terms of resource, risk, exposure, and many of these angles. So therefore, in farmer capacity building, while we talked about farmer produce organization as an institution which will help, I think there is a journey that one needs to take there. And farmer capacity building is one area that philanthropy can go in. Obviously, the FPOs also will succeed only when there is a commercial glue to it as to why are we come together, how are we going to benefit out of this, are the area which is the starting point. Without that, obviously, the sustained progress of FPO will not be there. But there are elements in terms of how do you create capacity for self-governance, how do you create capacity for democratization of rights within the FPO, and there are elements which need to happen there. There are commercial aspects which market will take care. There are governance-related aspects which philanthropy can play a role. And the government role potentially is in facilitating and creating some kind of framework and a rule book for this natural resource and carbon market equivalent that I talked about. While much of that can happen as interested buyers and sellers of these credits can come together and create those markets, between the thought and scaled action, there is always a gap. And it is in linking that where government can also come in. And of course, the other more direct role in case of millets was in the form of creating that scale through the government programs for the midday meal as well as for the mother and child programs. For significant amount of scale can come from there. It's a more direct role which can also come in from the government there.
So I think for me, this was, a phenomenally insightful conversation. And as you were talking, sir, the one thing that struck me was the idea that the growth in millets is not just about ensuring that a magical crop sort of becomes more viable, but I think it's also in ensuring that we are able to design for the new age agriculture model that takes into account some of the ecological constraints, the market constraints that we are working off. And that involves a certain level of rethinking of the economic model, which is who pays, for the benefits. The second is to institutionalize this market first approach that has already been done in Operation Flood and sustaining that thinking. And third is designing for diversification, because we sort of homogenize everything and then sort of scale it. But can we create an approach that actually matches diversification and scale? Because once we do that, I think the benefits accrued for the farmers at large is significantly more. And those are very first principles design that I think will help us think about how to, look at scaling the power and the benefits of millets, not just for India, and to honestly as a global product that India can spearhead as well. So lots to think about and lots to share. Thank you so much for your time and your rich experience. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
That's a succinct summary, Rathish. I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I think many elements have been pulled out through your interesting questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us here on Decoding Impact. We hope you enjoyed this episode and the conversation with our expert. To learn more about Sattva Knowledge Institute and our evidence-based insights, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, and explore our content on our website, all linked in the description.